the civil society can be very much engaged in the decision-making process and setting the goals, the Millennium Goals. It has a strong engagement with local communities. The civil society, for example, in Jordan, they have a strong engagement with different local communities, and that will bring out the priorities of the local communities, whether it is environment or economy or other priorities. So it represents more the grassroots, and it is usually diverse. It's different than the work of governments where it sets the policies, but it brings the local flavor. You have NGOs working in gender, in health, in environment, in social economic development, and all of those NGOs can bring at different levels, different engagement through communication, advocacy, helping in policy setting, priority setting, and also in implementation. This can be at a local level, but there are also NGOs who are working at a regional and global level. We know very well the conservation NGO international organizations like the World Conservation Union, BirdLife International, WWF, and others who are also working at a global level where they are influencing policies related to environment, policies related to biodiversity conservation, and they even develop criteria for governments to work on and implement. At a regional level, unfortunately, in the Arab world, it is quite weak. We don't see many NGOs working at a regional level, though some probably local NGOs, they have some regional role or some regional influence, but we cannot call them regional NGOs. And this, I think, one of the gaps in the Arab world, where you don't see lots of that kind of work, and maybe because of the the situation of the Arab world. But I think it's quite a need now to see. There are lots of cross-border issues. There are lots of common issues if we talk about environment, about gender, economic labor work. You see a lot of common issues that there is a need for local NGOs to come together and maybe form some kind of union or regional associations to share common issues. Civil society can concretely really engage on the ground in helping implementing the goals. For example, in Jordan and in environment, there's the Royal Society for the Conservation of Nature. It's fully dedicated to conservation work and biodiversity work, but using that to tackle other priority issues for local communities. For example, in the protected areas this NGO is managing, it introduced ecotourism that helped the local economy. They used ecotourism as a tool for conservation, so it tackled the environmental priorities, but also the priorities of the local community of those areas by bringing in ecotourism that exists because of the biodiversity uniqueness, but also it tackles issues related to gender. You can see local women now in those local areas are helping and working on product development. They produce products like organic farming and others, and those products are sold to the tourists and the locals visiting those areas. So it's actually, we cannot say that you only tackle environment, this NGO tackles economy or gender. You can have an integrated approach, and where this society demonstrated the ability to have an integrated approach that addressed local priorities, that is economy, but also addressed national priorities, that is conservation, where conservation was not necessarily a priority for that local community. But now it is a priority because it's a money-generating tool, and now it's created more education about conservation. So this is one example of how NGOs can be effective on the ground. At a government and parliamentary level, the parliament, members of parliament can engage with local communities, local NGOs, and in order when they push for policies, when they work with governments on laws, those laws should not have been created top-down. Parliamentarian can play a role to make sure that those laws are bottom-up, where they are can be practically implemented. They have the tools for that. The community, the local community in general, have understanding of those laws before they are adopted, and then they actually raise issues of gaps of those laws. So once they are engaged, they really protect those laws, help in enforcing them. But once they are prepared top down, they are surprised by them and not necessarily have ownership of those policies or laws. I believe there are many good examples of NGOs working on the ground. One example is the conservation organization. I mentioned the Royal Society for Conservation of Nature, but there are other NGOs who are engaging like in purely economic aspects, working with local community. There are those NGOs who have those kind of specific objectives and dedication and passion. They exist where no private sector or even government can exist. It's because they are flexible in decision-making process. They have this clear, focused priority and objectives. And this is where NGOs can be very much effective. You have NGOs adopting a whole local area to support economy, education, health services, etc. And there are lots of good examples in those fields and different NGOs, and very difficult for me to name the NGOs, but I believe we need to expose that. We need a forum, and whether it is the social media or internet or media in general and communication, to really bring out all those successful stories and share them with others, and not only successful stories, but the advantages and disadvantages and lessons learned. I think in general the Arab world lacks or is weak in having all those successful stories being shared and lessons learned being shared. We might have we know about the successful story, but we don't know what's behind it, how it reached there, what were the obstacles, the challenges. I think we need more communication shared between NGOs and between the different countries in those practical examples. The NGOs can make a big difference first if they are given, I believe, headroom by the government. They are not controlled by the government. The government should see them. Governments should see NGOs as assets for them and partner rather than a competitor, because they are playing a different role. Once the governments see the NGOs are assets, I think the whole equation is different. Usually NGOs are strong advocates and flexible in moving, so they probably hit sometimes on government's nerves. But I think if we change that attitude, where governments see them as partners, sees them as they cover areas where governments cannot cover, this is where they can see them complement their work. You can see in certain countries in the Arab world, maybe NGOs are not even allowed. And this is, I think, this one point that we need to really convince those governments that NGOs are assets. There are laws that restrict NGOs' work, whether in funding. NGOs have always an issue of funding, and they are good maybe or most of them are good in raising funds for specific projects, but they are not good or not necessarily attractive where they want to sustain themselves and cover some of their day-to-day cost. And this is a major obstacle in NGOs in the Arab world, because we don't have this culture of just sponsoring an NGO or being a member in that NGO and paying, just not necessarily paying for a specific project, but to pay for that NGO to continue to live. But where you can see in the Western world, in Europe and the States, you see lots of individuals, rich individuals or companies adopting or even leaving legacies to NGOs. We don't have this culture in the Arab world, and this is a major obstacle for NGOs to grow and sustain themselves.
If I may pick up on this point, so far from the presentation it emerged that, for example, a coalition of NGOs, something like a body, an entity which groups all the NGOs, would be good perhaps to make their voices heard, use them as a one focal point for the government. Do you think this could be an idea that would be feasible? Also, is there any coordination maybe between the NGOs?
You want me to reply?
If you can.
Some ways of having NGOs being effective, they come together. They come together as unions, but basically they come together as unions on certain specific issues. Like if you see environmental groups, environmental NGOs, they form in Jordan, for example, the Environmental Union. And this is meant to become more effective. Sometimes those coalitions, those unions of NGOs work, but sometimes they differ because they have different priorities. And so they end up discussing their own priorities rather than choosing common policy issues that they decide to advocate the government for. So I recommend if they come together, they don't necessarily have to be copy of each other. They need to select certain common issues. And where common issues, when you advocate the government, it's mainly about policies and laws. And this is where NGOs by themselves individually cannot be effective, but they can be effective in coming together. But not necessarily all the time they have to be together. I think they have to be together where there are common issues that affect across the policy they are dealing with, whether it is economic policies, gender policies, environmental policies, etc. It's very important for all the parties to always see themselves as complementing each other rather than competing with each other. Parliamentarians, government, NGOs, private sector. I believe also we should not miss out private sector. Private sector has a strong role in achieving those goals. They need to be engaged from day one. We should not see them as just money making or investors, but also they are important partners, whether through their employees, through the policies, through the area they're working with and in. I think they are important partners. Also media and communication people are very important partners. So I think we should look at all the stakeholders rather than just NGOs, government,